The dining hall fell silent the moment Duke Edmund Ashworth slammed his palm against the table. Every servant standing near the walls froze in place. Lady Eleanor Ashworth, seated at the far end of the long table, did not flinch. She simply set down her spoon and waited for her husband to speak. "From this morning forward," Edmund said, his voice carrying through the hall like a blade cutting through silk, "my wife will have no authority over this household. Not over the staff, not over the accounts, not over anything that happens within these walls. I am the master here, and I alone will decide how things are run." A young maid named Grace, standing near the kitchen door, felt her stomach twist. She had served under Lady Eleanor for 6 years, ever since she was a girl of 14 with trembling hands and no family to speak of. It was Lady Eleanor who had taught her to read, who had sat with her through fevers, who had never once raised her voice even when Grace broke the good china during her first month of service. Mr. Fenwick, the estate's steward, a tall man with silver hair and decades of quiet service behind him, cleared his throat carefully. "Your Grace, if I may." "You may not," Edmund cut in. "I have made my decision. Beginning today, all instructions will come from me directly. My wife's opinions on household matters are no longer required." Eleanor rose from her chair with the same grace she carried into every room. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply nodded once, folded her napkin, and walked toward the door leading to the garden, her footsteps steady despite the humiliation that had just been delivered in front of everyone she had cared for over the past 12 years. Edmund watched her leave, satisfied. He believed, with the full confidence of a man who had never questioned his own judgment, that nothing would change. The estate ran on schedules, on ledgers, on orders given and orders followed. What need was there for a woman's soft touch when there were rules to be obeyed? He did not see the way Grace's eyes followed Eleanor out the door. He did not see the older cook, a broad woman named Margaret who had worked in that kitchen for over 20 years, set down her knife and stare at the closed door for a long moment before returning to her chopping board with far less enthusiasm than before. He did not see Mr. Fenwick's jaw tighten, or the way the footmen exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. Edmund believed himself untouchable. He had grown up the only son of a demanding father who taught him that command was strength, and that anything softer was weakness. His wife's quiet way of running the household, remembering which maid's mother was ill, which footman needed an extra day off for his sister's wedding, which supplier to trust and which to avoid, had always seemed to him like unnecessary sentiment. He believed a household could run on rules alone, the way a clock ran on gears, without needing anyone to care whether the gears were tired or worn. That evening when Edmund sat down to dinner, he noticed the soup arrived nearly 20 minutes late. He said nothing, assuming it was a simple oversight. The following morning, when he asked for his usual breakfast, the kitchen sent up the wrong tea entirely, a blend he disliked, one that Eleanor had quietly ensured was never served to him in 12 years of marriage. Again, he brushed it aside as a minor mistake. But the mistakes did not stop. They multiplied quietly and steadily, like cracks spreading across a frozen pond. Eleanor, for her part, did not retreat into anger. She spent her mornings in the garden, tending to the roses she had planted the year she married Edmund. She spent her afternoons reading in the small study that had once been hers alone before Edmund claimed the larger library for himself. She did not speak ill of her husband to anyone, not even to Grace, who visited her quietly each afternoon with a tray of tea, an act of loyalty that technically violated the Duke's new command, but one that nobody dared report. "You are not angry, my lady?" Grace asked one afternoon, setting the tray down on the small table beside Eleanor's chair. Eleanor smiled faintly, though there was something tired behind her eyes. "Anger changes nothing, Grace. I have learned that lesson many times over. What matters is how people choose to act when no one is watching them." Grace did not fully understand what her mistress meant, not then. She would understand it soon enough. Within the servants' quarters, a quiet conversation was taking place that Edmund would never have imagined possible among people he considered merely instruments of his household. Mr. Fenwick had gathered the senior staff, Margaret the cook, Grace, the head footman named Oliver, and an older groundskeeper named Tobias, who had served the family since before Edmund was born. "He does not understand what he has done," Mr. Fenwick said quietly, his hands folded behind his back the way they always were when he was troubled. "He thinks a household runs on orders. He has never once asked himself why the orders worked so well for 12 years. "Because she made them work," Margaret said, her voice low but firm. "Every schedule, every supply order, every dispute between us that never reached his ears, she handled it all and she made it look effortless. That is not a small thing. That is not nothing." Oliver, the head footman, a young man in his late 20s with a serious face, spoke next. "What do we do, then? He has given his command. We cannot simply ignore him." "We do not ignore him," Mr. Fenwick said carefully. "We follow his orders exactly as given, nothing more and nothing less." Tobias, the old groundskeeper, gave a small knowing smile. "Ah, I see what you mean, Fenwick. He told us not to take instruction from her. He did not tell us to fix the problems that arise when her instruction is missing." "Precisely," Mr. Fenwick said. "We do exactly what he commands and nothing beyond it. Let him see in his own time what her presence truly meant." It was not rebellion, not in the way Edmund would have recognized it. There were no raised voices, no refused orders, no open defiance. It was something quieter and, in its own way, far more powerful. The household simply stopped filling in the gaps that Alina had always filled without anyone noticing. The invisible threads she had woven through every corner of the estate for over a decade began to unravel one at a time. The stable master, a stocky man named Peter, did not receive his usual reminder about the visiting horse trader's arrival, a task Alina had always handled personally because she remembered such details better than anyone. The trader arrived to find no one prepared to receive him, and he left in a temper, taking his finest horses to a rival estate instead. The seamstress, a quiet woman named Beatrice who worked in a small room on the 3rd floor, had always received her fabric orders through Alina, who understood precisely what colors and materials suited the household's needs throughout each season. Without her guidance, Beatrice was left waiting for instructions that never came, unsure whether to proceed with the winter garments at all. Edmund noticed none of this directly. He noticed only fragments, a delayed meal here, a missing letter there, a visitor who left in frustration for reasons he did not fully understand. He attributed each incident to carelessness among the staff, a problem he believed could be solved with sharper discipline. "The staff has grown lazy," he told his valet, a thin, nervous man named Arthur, one evening as he prepared for bed. "I will need to remind them who commands this house." Arthur, who had overheard more of the servants' quiet conversations than Edmund would have liked, said nothing. He simply nodded and continued folding his master's coat, keeping his thoughts carefully hidden behind a practiced, neutral expression. Meanwhile, in the garden, Alina continued her quiet routine, watching the roses bloom, watching the household she had built with such care begin to falter from a distance she had not chosen but now accepted with a strange, calm patience. She knew Edmund well enough to understand that he would not see the truth easily. Pride was a thick wall, and it would take more than a few delayed meals to bring it down. She thought back to the early years of their marriage, when Edmund had first brought her to this estate as a young bride of 19, unfamiliar with the size and complexity of the household she now oversaw. She remembered the mistakes she made then, ordering too much flour, misjudging the temperament of a particular housemaid, failing to notice when the roof above the east wing needed repair before the rains came. She remembered how she had learned, slowly and carefully, not through command but through listening. She had asked the older servants for their wisdom instead of assuming her title gave her all the answers. She had remembered names, birthdays, small sorrows and small joys. Over the years, that careful attention had woven itself into the very foundation of how the household functioned, so completely that no one, not even Alina herself, had fully recognized how essential it had become. Now Edmund believed he could remove that foundation with a single sentence spoken at a dinner table, as though 12 years of quiet effort could be undone by simple decree. Grace visited Alina again the following afternoon, this time with worry clearly written across her young face. "My lady, the household grows more disordered by the day," she said, sitting on the small stool beside Alina's chair, a familiarity Alina had always encouraged despite the difference in their stations. "Mrs. Margaret says the kitchen accounts have not been settled in over a week. Mr. Fenwick says 3 deliveries have gone unpaid because no one remembered to review the invoices. The Duke does not see it yet, but everyone else does." Alina set down her book and looked at Grace with quiet affection. "It is not my place to interfere, Grace. My husband has made his wishes clear." "But surely—" "I know this is difficult to understand," Alina said gently, "but sometimes the kindest thing a person can do is allow someone to see the truth for themselves in their own time, rather than forcing it upon them before they are ready to accept it. If I step in now, uninvited, it will only harden his resolve. He is a proud man, Grace. Pride does not bend to argument. It only bends to experience." Grace considered this for a long moment, her young mind working through a lesson far older than her years. "Then we wait," she said finally. "We wait," Alina agreed, "and we watch." What neither of them knew, not yet, was how quickly that waiting would come to an end, and how completely the household's quiet loyalty to Alina would soon be tested, in a way none of them could have predicted. Far away, on a road leading toward the estate, a carriage was already approaching, carrying news that would turn the household's quiet unraveling into a crisis no one could ignore, least of all Duke Edmund Ashworth himself. For now, though, the estate continued its slow, uneasy decline, each small failure a quiet testament to a truth the Duke had not yet learned to see, that a household, like any living thing, needed more than orders to survive. It needed care. It needed memory. It needed someone who understood that the people within its walls were not simply instruments to be commanded, but individuals whose loyalty could not be demanded, only earned. And Alina, sitting quietly in her garden among the roses she had planted with her own hands, understood something her husband did not yet grasp. She had never needed a title to hold authority over that household. She had earned it, one small kindness at a time, over 12 patient years. No command, however loudly spoken, could erase that so easily. The sun began to set over the estate, casting long shadows across the lawns Alina had once walked with such quiet confidence. Somewhere inside the great house, Edmund sat alone in his study, unaware that the foundation beneath his feet had already begun to shift, and that no command, however forcefully delivered, could stop what was coming. The carriage arrived just before noon, its wheels crunching over the gravel drive with an urgency that caught the attention of every window facing the front of the estate. Grace was the first to see it from the second floor, and she hurried down the stairs to alert Mr. Fenwick, who met the visitor at the door with his usual composed manner, though something in his chest tightened the moment he recognized the coat of arms painted on the carriage door. It belonged to Lord Harrington, an old friend of Edmund's late father, a man whose approval mattered greatly to the Ashworth name and whose visits, though rare, always carried weight. He had sent word only 2 days earlier that he wished to call upon the estate, but the letter announcing the exact date had gone missing somewhere between the front hall and Edmund's desk, a small failure that would have been impossible under Alina's careful management, but which now slipped through the cracks of a household no longer functioning as it once had. Edmund, unaware that his guest had arrived a full day earlier than he expected, was out riding across the eastern fields, leaving the household scrambling to prepare a proper welcome with almost no warning at all. "We must act quickly," Mr. Fenwick said, gathering the senior staff in the entrance hall the moment Lord Harrington was shown into the drawing room with polite apologies for the delay. The guest chambers have not been aired in weeks. The kitchen has no proper meal prepared for a guest of his standing, and His Grace will not return for several hours yet. Margaret, the cook, wiped her hands nervously on her apron. I have only simple stew prepared today, nothing fit for a man like Lord Harrington. Grace, standing near the doorway, felt a familiar name rise unbidden to her lips. She hesitated only a moment before speaking it aloud. Lady Eleanor would know what to do. The room fell quiet. Mr. Fenwick's eyes moved toward the garden path visible through the tall windows, where Eleanor could still be seen among her roses. Unaware of the small crisis unfolding inside the house she had once commanded with such quiet skill. The Duke gave clear instructions, Oliver, the head footman, said carefully, though there was no real conviction in his voice. We are not to seek her guidance. The Duke also expects this household to reflect well upon his name, Mr. Fenwick replied, his tone measured but firm. He did not anticipate a guest arriving without warning while he is away. I believe, under these circumstances, we must use our own judgment. No one argued further. Mr. Fenwick walked out to the garden himself, his pace quicker than his usual dignified stride, and found Eleanor exactly where he expected her, seated beneath the old oak tree with a book resting unopened in her lap, her eyes distant with thought. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly despite the urgency in his voice, "forgive the intrusion, but Lord Harrington has arrived, a full day earlier than expected, and the household is not prepared to receive him properly. His Grace is away and will not return for hours." Eleanor's expression shifted immediately from quiet contemplation to sharp, practical focus, the same look Mr. Fenwick remembered from countless small crises over the years, moments when her calm authority had steadied the entire household. For a brief instant, old habit nearly carried her straight toward the house. Then she paused. "Mr. Fenwick," she said carefully, "my husband was quite clear. I no longer have authority here." "With respect, my lady," Mr. Fenwick said, his voice low and earnest, "the household does not function without you. We have tried these past days to manage without your guidance, and I will not pretend to you that it has gone well. Lord Harrington's opinion matters greatly to the Ashworth name, and if this visit goes poorly, the consequences will reach far beyond a single afternoon's embarrassment." Eleanor considered this for a long moment, weighing her husband's pride against the reputation of a household she had spent 12 years building with her own hands. She thought of Grace, of Margaret, of every servant who had shown her nothing but loyalty even after being commanded otherwise. She thought, too, of what it would mean to simply step aside and allow the consequences to unfold entirely on their own, a lesson delivered without her interference. But a household's reputation was not only Edmund's burden to carry. It belonged to everyone within its walls, and Eleanor could not, in good conscience, allow good people to suffer for a mistake that was not their own. "Very well," she said finally, rising from her seat with quiet determination. "But you must understand, Mr. Fenwick, I do this for the household, not in defiance of my husband. Let that be remembered should it matter later." "It will be remembered, my lady," Mr. Fenwick said, relief clear in his voice. "I promise you that." What followed was a transformation the household staff would speak of for years afterward. Eleanor moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency she had always possessed, issuing instructions gently but clearly, never raising her voice, never showing the slightest hint of the humiliation she had endured only days earlier. She sent Grace to prepare the blue guest chamber, the one with the finest view of the eastern gardens, knowing it would please a man like Lord Harrington, who had always admired fine landscapes. She instructed Margaret to abandon the simple stew and instead prepare a roasted pheasant dish that Eleanor knew, from a conversation years earlier, was Lord Harrington's particular favorite, a small detail she had remembered without effort. the way she remembered nearly everything that mattered to the people around her. She asked Oliver to bring out the good silver, carefully polished and stored away for occasions exactly like this one, and she personally selected a bottle of wine from the cellar that she knew Edmund's father had once shared with Lord Harrington many years before. A sentimental touch, she suspected, would not go unnoticed by a man of his generation. Within 2 hours, the entire household had transformed from quiet disorder into the elegant, welcoming atmosphere it had always been known for. Lord Harrington, seated comfortably in the drawing-room with a glass of fine wine in hand, remarked more than once to the servant attending him how impressed he was by the household's hospitality, entirely unaware of the frantic preparation that had taken place only hours before his arrival. When Edmund finally returned from his ride, dusty and unaware of the crisis that had nearly unfolded in his absence, he was met at the door by Mr. Fenwick, who informed him calmly that Lord Harrington had arrived earlier than expected and was already comfortably settled, awaiting dinner. Edmund, surprised but pleased, assumed the household had simply managed the situation on its own, exactly as he had always believed it should. He straightened his coat, thanked Mr. Fenwick briskly, and made his way toward the drawing-room to greet his guest, entirely unaware that his wife's quiet hand had guided every detail of the afternoon's success. It was only during dinner, as Lord Harrington praised the exquisite meal and commented warmly on the thoughtful choice of wine, mentioning specifically how it reminded him of evenings spent with Edmund's late father, that a flicker of suspicion crossed Edmund's mind. He glanced briefly toward the head of the table, where Aliner's chair remained conspicuously empty, a detail Lord Harrington was too polite to question aloud, but which Edmund noticed with growing discomfort. "Your household runs remarkably well, Edmund," Lord Harrington said between bites, his tone warm and genuine. "Your wife's touch, I imagine. I recall she always had a gift for these small details." Edmund hesitated, unsure how to answer without revealing the truth of the past few days. "The staff manages things capably," he said finally, his voice carrying less confidence than he intended. Lord Harrington raised an eyebrow slightly but said nothing further, sensing perhaps that he had touched upon a subject better left alone. The conversation moved on to other matters, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in Edmund's mind, a small crack in the certainty he had carried so confidently only days before. Later that evening, after Lord Harrington had retired to his chamber for the night, Edmund found Mr. Fenwick in the hallway and asked, with carefully controlled curiosity, how exactly the household had managed such an impressive display on such short notice. Mr. Fenwick, ever loyal but unwilling to lie outright to his master, chose his words with great care. "The staff did everything within their power to ensure the household reflected well upon your name, your grace. We understood the importance of the occasion." It was not quite the full truth, but it was not a lie either, and Edmund, still too proud to ask the question directly, chose not to press further that night. But as he climbed the stairs toward his chamber, passing the closed door of the room where Aliner now slept alone, he found himself pausing, if only for a moment, wondering exactly how the pheasant dish had come to be prepared, and how the servants had known, without being told, precisely which wine his father had once shared with an old friend. The doubt was small, barely more than a whisper in the back of his mind, but it was there, and it would not be so easily silenced in the days that followed. 3 days after Lord Harrington's departure, Edmund summoned Mr. Fenwick to his study, determined to uncover the truth behind the household's mysterious success. He sat behind his father's old oak desk, his fingers drumming against the polished wood, his expression unusually tense for a man who prided himself on iron composure. "I want a full account of the arrangements made for Lord Harrington's visit," Edmund said, his voice sharp. "Every detail, Mr. Fenwick. I will not be lied to in my own household." Mr. Fenwick stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral despite the weight of the moment pressing down upon him. He had served the Ashworth family long enough to know that honesty, however uncomfortable, was always the wiser path. "Your Grace," he said evenly. The guest chambers were prepared, the meal selected, and the wine chosen through the guidance of Lady Alina. I sought her counsel because the household was not equipped to manage the visit without her, and I judged the reputation of this estate to be at greater risk than the consequences of my disobedience. Edmund's jaw tightened visibly. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window, as though wrestling with something far larger than the simple fact just presented to him. "I gave a clear command," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered just beneath the surface. "You disobeyed it." "I did, Your Grace," Mr. Fenwick admitted without hesitation. "And I would do so again if the household's honor were at stake. I have served this family for 30 years. I have watched Lady Alina build this household into something remarkable, detail by detail, kindness by kindness. I cannot, in good conscience, watch it crumble simply because pride demands it." The word pride struck Edmund harder than he expected. He rose from his chair, packing toward the window, his hands clasped tightly behind his back in an unconscious mirror of his steward's posture. "You believe this is about pride?" he asked, though the question felt more directed at himself than at Mr. Fenwick. "I believe, Your Grace," Mr. Fenwick said carefully, "that you have mistaken authority for control. A household is not a machine that runs on commands alone. It is made of people, and people do not follow orders out of fear alone, not for long. They follow leadership that has earned their trust. Lady Alina earned that trust over 12 years, one small act of care at a time. That kind of trust cannot be commanded into existence, nor can it be commanded away." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them. Finally, he dismissed Mr. Fenwick with a curt wave of his hand, though the steward noticed, as he closed the study door behind him, that the Duke's shoulders remained tense, his posture rigid with thoughts he was clearly unwilling to voice aloud. Over the following days, Edmund began to observe his household more closely than he had in years, though he told himself he was simply ensuring the staff performed their duties properly. He watched Grace move through the halls with quiet efficiency, noticing for the first time how she greeted each servant by name, how she remembered small details about their lives that Edmund himself had never bothered to learn. He watched Margaret in the kitchen, overhearing her mutter under her breath about missing ingredients that Alina would have ordered weeks in advance, details that now slipped through the cracks of a system missing its careful architect. He began to notice, too, the way the staff spoke of Alina when they believed he was not listening. There was no bitterness in their voices, no resentment toward her for the humiliation she had endured. There was only quiet respect, the kind of respect that could not be purchased with wages or commanded with threats. One afternoon, Edmund found himself standing outside the garden gate, watching his wife from a distance as she knelt beside her roses, her hands carefully tending to the soil with the same patient attention she had once given to every corner of the household. He had not spoken to her directly since the day he stripped her of her authority, communicating only through curt notes delivered by servants when absolutely necessary. He almost turned away, his pride urging him back toward the safety of his study. But something held him in place, some quiet curiosity he could not fully explain, and he found himself walking toward the garden gate instead. Alina looked up as he approached, her expression calm and unreadable, betraying none of the hurt she had carried quietly since that humiliating dinner. "Edmund," she said simply, using his given name rather than his title. A small intimacy she had not offered him in days. "The roses look well," he said, an awkward attempt at conversation that felt foreign on his tongue. "They require patience," Alina replied, returning her attention to the soil. "More patience than most things in life, I have found. You cannot command a rose to bloom. You can only give it what it needs and trust that it will grow in its own time." Edmund understood, even as the words left her mouth, that she was not speaking only of roses. He stood there for a long moment, unsure how to respond, his pride warring silently against the growing weight of doubt that had settled over him these past days. "The household has struggled," he admitted finally, the words costing him more effort than he expected. "Since my command." Alina did not look up immediately, though her hands paused briefly over the soil. "Households are like gardens, Edmund. They require tending, not merely ownership. A title does not make the roses bloom any more than a command makes a household run smoothly. It takes care and attention, and the willingness to learn what each person within it truly needs." "And you believe I have failed to provide that," Edmund said, his voice carrying less defensiveness than it once might have. "I believe," Alina said carefully, finally meeting his eyes, "that you have spent your life believing strength means control. Your father taught you that, I think, though I never knew him well enough to say for certain. But strength and control are not the same thing, Edmund. Sometimes the strongest choice a person can make is to trust others, to allow them the freedom to care for what they have built, rather than commanding them into submission." Edmund said nothing for a long moment, the truth of her words settling uncomfortably in his chest. He was not yet ready to admit defeat, not yet ready to reverse the command he had issued with such confidence only days before. But something had shifted within him, a crack widening slowly in the wall of pride he had built around himself since childhood. "I will consider what you have said," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, before turning and walking back toward the house, leaving Alina alone once more among her roses. That evening, as Edmund sat alone in his study reviewing the household accounts, he discovered discrepancies that troubled him deeply. Several invoices remained unpaid, their due dates long since passed. A shipment of grain, ordered weeks earlier, had never arrived, apparently lost amid the confusion of a household no longer operating under careful oversight. The stable master's request for new equipment had gone unanswered for over a week, buried beneath a growing pile of neglected correspondence. He sat back in his chair, staring at the ledger before him, the numbers blurring together as the full weight of the situation settled over him. For 12 years, he had assumed the household ran smoothly because of the rules he had established, the structure he believed he alone provided. He had never once considered that the true architecture holding everything together had been his wife's quiet, patient attention to 1,000 small details he had never bothered to notice. He thought of his father, a man who had ruled his own household with an iron fist, demanding obedience without ever earning genuine loyalty. Edmund remembered with sudden clarity how the servants of his childhood home had always seemed distant, fearful, quick to comply, but never truly devoted. He had believed that was simply the natural order of things, the proper relationship between master and servant. He had never considered that it might have been a failure, rather than a strength. Grace, meanwhile, continued her quiet visits to Alina each afternoon, though the tension within the household had begun to shift in ways she could sense but not fully articulate. The staff no longer whispered nervously about the Duke's temper. Instead, they spoke quietly among themselves about the accounts left unpaid, the shipments gone missing, the small failures accumulating like stones building toward an avalanche. "He watched you today," Grace told Alina during one such visit, setting down the tea tray with practiced care. "From the garden gate, I saw him." Alina's expression remained composed, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. "He spoke with me as well." "And?" Grace asked, unable to hide her curiosity. "And nothing has changed yet," Alina said gently. "Pride does not dissolve in a single conversation, Grace. It takes time, and often it takes a crisis far greater than delayed meals and unpaid invoices before a man like my husband is willing to admit he was wrong." Grace considered this thoughtfully, her young mind turning the words over carefully. "Do you believe such a crisis is coming, my lady?" Alina was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the window and the fields beyond, where storm clouds had begun gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy against the fading afternoon light. "I believe," she said finally, "that every household eventually faces a moment that reveals its true foundation, whether that foundation is strong or weak. I do not know when that moment will come for us, Grace, but I suspect, given everything that has already begun to unravel, that it will not be long now." Grace shivered slightly, though the room was warm, sensing something in her mistress's words that felt less like idle speculation and more like quiet, certain foresight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows gently, as the storm clouds continued their slow march toward the estate, carrying with them a crisis that would soon test everything the household had quietly built, and everything Edmund had so confidently believed he could command into existence. The storm broke that night with a violence the estate had not seen in years. Rain lashed against the windows in heavy sheets, and thunder rolled across the sky like distant cannon fire. By midnight, a messenger arrived at the front gate, soaked through and breathless, carrying urgent news that would shatter whatever calm remained within the household. The Eastern Bridge, the only route connecting the estate to the nearby village and, more importantly, to the physician who tended the family's affairs, had collapsed under the weight of the rising floodwaters. Worse still, young Peter, the stable master's son, had fallen ill with a fever that had worsened rapidly over the past 2 days, and without the physician, there was no one within reach who could properly treat him. Edmund was roused from his study, where he had fallen asleep over the household ledgers, and informed of the crisis by a frantic Mr. Fenwick, whose usual composure had finally begun to crack under the strain of the past week. "Your Grace, the boy's fever has worsened considerably," Mr. Fenwick said, his voice tight with urgency. "His mother fears he will not survive the night without proper care. The physician cannot reach us, not with the bridge gone, and I confess I do not know what remedies might ease his condition. This is beyond my knowledge, Your Grace." Edmund stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation crashing over him with sudden, terrible clarity. He had never concerned himself with the details of the estate's medical needs, had never bothered to learn which herbs eased a fever or which remedies calmed a troubled chest. Such matters had always been handled quietly, efficiently, by his wife, a fact he had never once appreciated until this very moment. "Fetch Lady Eleanor," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he had fully considered the reversal they represented. Mr. Fenwick did not hesitate. Within minutes, Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, her hair loose around her shoulders, a simple robe wrapped tightly against the cold, but her expression already sharp with focused determination, the same expression Mr. Fenwick remembered from countless crises over the years. "Take me to him," she said simply, and the household moved as one, following her lead without hesitation, the days of confusion and quiet failure suddenly replaced by purposeful, unified action. Eleanor knelt beside young Peter's bed, feeling his forehead with practiced hands, checking the color of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing, the way his small chest rose and fell with obvious effort. She turned to Margaret, who stood anxiously nearby, tears streaking her weathered face. "Fetch willow bark from the still room, and cold water as much as you can carry," Eleanor instructed calmly. "And Grace, I need clean linens and the small blue bottle from the medicine cabinet in my old study, the one with the elderflower tincture." The staff moved instantly, without question, grateful for clear direction after days of uncertainty. Edmund stood in the doorway, watching his wife work with quiet, practiced skill, tending to the boy with the same patient care she had once given to every corner of the household he had so carelessly dismissed as unnecessary. Hours passed. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the small room, Eleanor remained steady, applying cool compresses, coaxing the boy to drink small sips of the bitter willow bark tea, speaking to him softly whenever his fevered eyes fluttered open in confusion and fear. Edmund watched, unable to look away, as his wife did the work of a dozen people, her hands never trembling despite the exhaustion clearly etched across her face as the night wore on. Peter's mother, a quiet woman named Beatrice who worked as the household seamstress, sat at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, occasionally glancing toward Alina with an expression of desperate gratitude that needed no words to convey its meaning. Near dawn, the fever finally began to break. Peter's breathing steadied, his skin cooled beneath Alina's careful attention, and his eyes opened, clearer than they had been in hours, focusing weakly on his mother's face with something resembling recognition. "Mama," he whispered hoarsely, and Beatrice broke into quiet, relieved tears, clutching her son's small hand tightly within her own. Alina sat back finally, her shoulders sagging slightly with exhaustion, though a quiet smile crossed her tired face as she watched mother and son reunited. She rose slowly, gathering the empty cups and cool cloths scattered around the bed, preparing to return to her own quarters for what remained of the night. It was then that she noticed Edmund, still standing in the doorway, his expression unlike anything she had seen from him in years. Gone was the pride, the rigid certainty that had defined him since the day of their humiliating dinner. In its place was something rawer, more vulnerable, an expression of a man confronting the full weight of his own failures. "You saved him," Edmund said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The willow bark saved him," Alina replied gently, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet exhaustion. "I merely knew where to find it and how to use it. Knowledge that comes from years of tending to this household's needs, Edmund, not from any special gift I was born with." "Knowledge I dismissed," Edmund said, the admission clearly costing him something deep and painful. "Knowledge I called unnecessary." Alina said nothing, allowing the silence to speak for itself, watching her husband wrestle visibly with the truth he had spent the past week trying desperately to avoid. Outside the small room, word of the night's events had already begun spreading through the household. Grace, exhausted but unable to sleep, found herself in the kitchen alongside Margaret and Oliver, the three of them sharing quiet cups of tea as the storm outside finally began to weaken into a gentle, steady rain. "The Duke saw everything," Grace said softly, still processing the events of the long night. "He watched her save that boy's life with his own eyes." "Pride is a stubborn thing," Margaret said, shaking her head slowly. "But even the stubbornest pride cannot survive watching someone you love save a child's life while you stand helpless in the doorway." Oliver nodded thoughtfully, staring into his teacup. "I overheard Mr. Fenwick speaking with the other footmen earlier. He believes the Duke has finally begun to understand what the rest of us have known all along." "And what is that?" Grace asked. "That authority earned through years of care cannot be replaced by a single command," Oliver said quietly, "no matter how forcefully that command is spoken." The household, exhausted but relieved, settled into an uneasy quiet as dawn finally broke over the estate, the storm clouds beginning to part to reveal the first pale light of morning. Word of young Peter's recovery spread quickly among the staff, bringing with it a cautious sense of hope that had been absent from the household for days. But the true test, as Alina herself had quietly predicted days earlier, was not simply Peter's recovery. It was what Edmund would choose to do now that he had witnessed, with his own eyes, the truth he had spent so long refusing to see. He remained awake long after Alina had finally retired to rest, packing the halls of his study as the morning light grew stronger outside his window. He thought of his father, of the cold, distant household he had grown up within, of the lesson he had absorbed so completely that command alone was sufficient to hold a household together. He thought, too, of the past week, of delayed meals and unpaid invoices, of Lord Harrington's visit saved only through his wife's quiet intervention, of a young boy's fever broken not by his own hand, but by the careful knowledge his wife had built over 12 patient years, a knowledge he had so carelessly dismissed as unnecessary sentiment. By the time the sun had fully risen over the estate, Edmund had reached a decision, though it would take him the remainder of the day to summon the courage necessary to act upon it, a courage far more difficult to gather than the pride that had guided him so confidently only a week before. By late afternoon, word had spread quietly through the household that Duke Edmund Ashworth had summoned every member of the staff to gather in the great hall, an unusual request that filled the servants with a mixture of curiosity and quiet apprehension. No one knew quite what to expect. Some feared punishment for the quiet defiance of the past week. Others, having witnessed the events of the previous night firsthand, dared to hope for something entirely different. Eleanor, informed of the gathering by Grace, chose to remain in her private study, unwilling to assume anything about her husband's intentions after the humiliation she had endured only days before. She had learned, through years of careful patience, not to expect too much from moments that seemed promising, lest disappointment follow swiftly behind. The great hall filled slowly with familiar faces. Mr. Fenwick stood near the front, his posture as composed as ever, though his eyes carried a quiet watchfulness he rarely allowed others to see. Margaret stood beside Grace, her weathered hands still faintly trembling from the exhaustion of the previous night. Oliver and the other footmen gathered near the tall windows, while Tobias the groundskeeper and Beatrice the seamstress, her son Peter finally resting peacefully under careful watch, stood near the back of the hall, their faces etched with cautious curiosity. Edmund entered the hall dressed simply, without the formal coat he usually wore when addressing his household, a small detail that did not go unnoticed by those who knew him well. He stood before them for a long moment, his expression unusually uncertain, a stark contrast to the commanding confidence he had displayed only a week earlier at that fateful dinner. "I owe this household an apology," he began, his voice carrying none of the sharp authority it once held, replaced instead by something quieter, more genuine. "Nearly 2 weeks ago, I stood before you and declared that my wife's presence within this household was unnecessary, that authority alone, backed by nothing but my title, was sufficient to hold this estate together. I was wrong." A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the gathered staff, though no one dared interrupt as the Duke continued, his words coming more easily now that he had crossed the difficult threshold of admission. "I watched, these past days, as this household struggled under the weight of my pride. I watched invoices go unpaid, shipments go missing, and a valued guest nearly slighted through my own carelessness, a disaster averted only because you, all of you, chose loyalty to this household over blind obedience to my foolish command. And last night, I watched my wife save a young boy's life through knowledge and care I had dismissed as unnecessary sentiment, knowledge she built patiently over 12 years while I remained blind to its true value." He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the gathered faces, each one representing a small act of quiet loyalty that had, together, held the household together despite his own failures. "I understand now," he continued, "that authority is not something a title grants automatically. It is something earned, through years of care and attention to the people who depend upon you. My wife earned that authority long ago, far more completely than I ever did through simple command. I was too proud to see it, and my pride nearly cost this household everything it has built over the past 12 years. He turned then toward the doorway, where Eleanor now stood, having been quietly summoned by Mr. Fenwick without Edmund's direct knowledge. Drawn by a message that simply read that her presence was requested in the great hall, she stood there now, still in the same simple dress she had worn for days, her expression uncertain as she took in the scene before her. Edmund crossed the hall toward her, his usual composed stride replaced by something more hesitant, more humble than the household had ever witnessed from their Duke. He stopped before her, and for a long moment neither spoke, the weight of the past 2 weeks hanging heavily in the silence between them. "Eleanor," he said finally, using her name without title, the same quiet intimacy she had offered him days earlier in the garden. I was wrong to believe this household could run on command alone. I was wrong to dismiss 12 years of your quiet, patient care as unnecessary. This household is not mine because of my title. It is ours, built through your hands as much as through my name, and I ask humbly that you resume your rightful place within it, not because I command it, but because I finally understand what that place truly means. Alina studied her husband's face carefully, searching for any trace of the pride that had driven him to such cruelty only weeks before. What she found instead was something rawer, more honest than she had seen from him in years, a vulnerability that spoke louder than any formal apology ever could. "You humiliated me before this entire household," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly present beneath her words. "That is not so easily forgotten, Edmund." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "And I do not ask you to forget it. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, through my actions rather than my words, that I have truly learned what my pride so nearly cost us both." The hall remained silent, every servant watching the exchange with quiet, held breath, until finally Alina reached out and gently took her husband's offered hand, a small gesture that carried within it the full weight of forgiveness not yet complete, but genuinely begun. A quiet murmur of relief passed through the gathered staff, and Mr. Fenwick allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. 30 years of loyal service, finally rewarded with the restoration of the balance he had always known this household required. In the weeks that followed, the estate slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, though something fundamental had shifted within it. Edmund began spending time alongside Alina as she managed the household's affairs, asking questions he had never bothered to ask before, learning the names and stories of servants he had once considered simply instruments of his will. He learned, slowly and with genuine effort, the quiet art his wife had mastered over 12 patient years, an art built not on command, but on care, memory, and the willingness to see each person within the household as an individual deserving of respect. Grace continued her afternoon visits to Alina, though now they often took place in the household's main study rather than the quiet garden, as Alina resumed her rightful place at the center of the estate's daily life. Margaret's kitchen returned to its efficient rhythm, invoices paid promptly, supplies ordered with careful foresight, meals prepared with the thoughtful attention that had once again become the household's quiet hallmark. Young Peter recovered fully within a fortnight, his fever nothing more than a distant memory, though his mother Beatrice never forgot the night Lady Alina's careful hands had saved her son's life, a debt of gratitude that would remain unspoken but deeply felt for years to come. Edmund, for his part, never again attempted to command his household into submission through pride alone. He had learned, through humiliation and near disaster, a lesson his own father had never taught him, that true strength lay not in the ability to issue commands, but in the wisdom to recognize and honor the quiet, patient care that truly held a household and a marriage together. Years later, when their own children grew old enough to understand the story, servants who remained within the household would sometimes share the tale quietly among themselves, a story passed down through the estate's history, as a gentle reminder that no title, however grand, could ever truly replace the quiet, earned loyalty of those who choose, freely and completely, where their true devotion belongs. And Alina, tending to her roses each morning just as she always had, understood better than anyone that the household's strength had never come from a single command, spoken loudly at the head of a dinner table. It had come, instead, from 1,000 small acts of care, repeated patiently over years, until an entire household, given the choice, chose her without hesitation, and in doing so, taught even the proudest of men the true meaning of authority earned rather than simply demanded.